The March budget saw selective tax cuts, but the bigger picture is that taxes as a share of GDP is rising, and it's predicted to keep rising to record levels. And even the government's own forecast is based on severe and likely undeliverable cuts to government spending. In reality, there will be strong pressure to keep increasing taxes in the next parliament. But why are taxes rising so much? How does the UK compare to other countries? And are there any alternatives? Just a couple of years ago, UK taxes were lower than the OECD average, but now they are forecast to rise closer to European levels. To maintain public services at a satisfactory level may well require a tax burden closer to 40% of GDP. The country faces difficult choices. The public are deeply dissatisfied with the state of public services, and particularly concerned with the NHS. Yet, if the government wants to maintain low taxes and improve services at the same time, it faces a near impossible juggling act. The fundamental issue is that economic growth has slowed down drastically since the Great Financial Crisis. In the post-war period, the UK economy was growing by around 2.5% a year, but since 2009, it's averaged only 1%, and per capita growth is even worse, and this is what's important for per capita public services. Another important factor is that in the post-war period, we were able to reduce defence spending as a share of GDP quite considerably. It's a so-called peace dividend, and it enabled us to spend a higher share on health as we cut defence. Guns for hospital beds was quite a good trade-off. But recent geopolitical events have put pressure to actually increase defence spending back closer towards 3% of GDP. So that's another pressure for higher taxes coming. Now, what does the government actually spend its money on? The biggest department is healthcare, followed by social security for pensions and working age people. It is health and pensions which are the biggest growth areas of government spending. For example, pension spending has increased to £126 billion and is forecast to keep growing to 171 in the next few years. Now, this is partly due to demographics. We have an ageing population, more people living longer. Also, pensioners have been more protected with a pension triple lock guarantee. You can see that pensions have increased at a faster rate than working age benefits. Now, one alternative to increasing taxes is to raise the retirement age. This has two effects. Firstly, it reduces government spending, and secondly, increases the labour force. Now, the pension age is already set to increase to 68 by 2044. However, the International Longevity Centre suggests a sustainable dependency ratio would require an increase in the retirement age to 71 by 2050. Now, that is definitely an alternative to paying high tax, and you could argue from an economic perspective it has certain advantages, reduces government spending and increases the labour participation rate. However, there are also very significant drawbacks. Those with manual type jobs will be disproportionately affected. It's more difficult to keep working if you have to do physical labour. But secondly, although we're seeing a rise in life expectancy, we're not necessarily seeing a rise in healthy life expectancy. In some of the most deprived areas of the UK, the healthy life expectancy, the age at which you can keep working, is as low as 51 on average. Therefore, there's a real concern that increasing the pension age to 71 will cause problems for people with ill health or difficult for people who don't have a private pension. Also, worth bearing in mind that UK pensions are not particularly generous by international standards. The UK spending as a share of GDP is around 6%, and this compares to, say, 16% in Italy. Healthcare is another department that has seen a significant rise in real spending per capita, but it doesn't seem enough to keep up with the growing demand. One reason is that there's more healthcare treatments available than in the past, but also these are much more expensive. For example, cancer rates have increased in recent decades, yet at the same time mortality rates from cancer have fallen by around 35%. This is one good news story, a success story, but also it's expensive. Now, most advanced industrial societies have seen a growth in healthcare spending as a share of GDP in the post-war period. There's a global trend to spending more on healthcare faster than economic growth. And as we live longer, we're more likely to suffer from medical conditions. For example, there's been a growth in neurological disorders such as dementia, Parkinson, and this is expected to only get much worse in the coming decades. And this requires not only healthcare, but also expensive social care, which is one of the largest budgets for local councils that are struggling to keep up with. Now, in the early 2010s, the government kept healthcare as a share of GDP constant. In fact, it slightly declined. And it bucked the post-war trend and the international trend to more healthcare spending. But the healthcare system struggled to keep up. We saw a rise in waiting lists, and then the crisis of COVID exposed the underlying shortages in the system. Even optimistic forecasts for waiting lists only show a modest decline in the coming years. If we really want to keep healthcare services up to date, there's a strong pressure to raise taxes. And there are not many palatable alternatives to increasing taxes. Some countries use private health insurance, but there's not so much benefit if you get a tax cut, but then have to spend a new bill on private health insurance. An extreme solution would be greater rationing of services. Should people in their 80s be given a triple heart bypass operation? Now, it's okay to answer in a philosophical abstract, but healthcare is something that we all have a very personal experience of. Once you've been stuck in A&E for 24 hours, you have a pretty good idea of the state of the healthcare system. And this is perhaps why so many people, at least in surveys, say they'd rather prioritise public services than tax cuts. And perhaps with healthcare, there's a greater public willingness to pay tax. And one option may be for the government to bring in a specific health tax, which may be a way to make it more palatable for people to pay more tax. Now, increased healthcare spending, in a way, is a sign of progress, because it enables us to live longer and hopefully have better quality of life. But there is another side of a coin, and that is also we're seeing a rise in the diseases of affluence, such as obesity, diabetes and heart disease. And so the way to improve a nation's health is not just about more spending and higher taxes, but also changes to lifestyle like more exercise. Now, since 2009, real household disposable income has barely increased. This means that households are paying less income tax and less VAT than you might expect. But at the same time, there's an increase in demand for government spending and benefits. For example, low wage growth but rising house prices has seen a growth in housing benefit and the need for more universal credit. There's also been a rise in long-term sickness, pushing up disability benefits quite substantially. And the government welfare bill would have been even higher if it hadn't imposed all the benefit caps. Now, taxes may be rising, but even so, inequality has also increased. There's going to be an increase in the proportion of children living in absolute poverty, and the benefit caps is a significant component of that. Now, sometimes cutting benefits is cited as a solution, as an alternative to high taxes. But recent years have seen, for many on benefits, much higher inflation rate than the increase in benefits. And further cuts in welfare would almost certainly further worsen problems of inequality and poverty. Now, going back to the government forecast for spending and debt, these spending include quite stringent budget cuts for certain departments. Already per capita spending has been cut for many departments, and these are likely to increase in the coming years if the targets are to be met. Some departments get much less political interest. For example, spending on prisons is not a high priority, and as a result, UK prisons are overcrowded and near breaking point. In March 2024, prison capacity in England and Wales was 89,000, but prison population was 88,200. And to deal with this crisis of no places left, non-serious offenders may have to be released 2 months early from their sentence. But like many issues, it's just going to get worse. The government's own forecasts suggest that the prison population is forecast to rise from 89,000 today to 94,000 by 2025 and nearly 100,000 by 2026. Now, of course, one alternative to spending more on prisons and building new prisons is challenging the recent trend to sending ever more people to prison. But that's a separate issue we haven't got time to go into. Now, what about immigration? It's quite striking that in the recent OBR forecasts for future government debt, low immigration scenarios led to significantly higher debt levels and more pressure to put up taxes. high migration could lead to 10% lower debt to GDP by 2028. The logic there is that higher migration of working age people tends to be a net fiscal benefit because the government receive tax, but they don't have to pay pensions and so much healthcare. Even accounting for a need to increase per capita spending on services, short-term tax rises could be avoided through much higher immigration. However, that doesn't mean it's necessarily a solution for a few reasons. Firstly, fast population growth has put upward pressure on house prices and rents. Also, David Miles of the OBR gave a written report to Parliament saying that immigration may not be the large net fiscal benefit that you might think, because if migrants stay in the long term and reach pension age, then that net fiscal benefit starts to become neutral. Also, to take another example, British universities, many are running deficits, short of finance. And in a way, foreign students are effectively subsidising the UK taxpayer. They help to pay for universities quite a lot. And if you took foreign students away, there'd be an even bigger funding gap and pressure for higher taxes to pay for universities. Overall, wherever we look, public finances are squeezed. Courts face growing backlogs. Many local councils face bankruptcy, even though local services like local libraries have been cut quite severely in the past decade or so. Now, often the government have sought to improve short-term finances by cutting long-term public investment. But if the UK is ever to turn around its rather dire economic growth forecasts, we can't keep cutting investment. If anything, we need to do more of that. Now, the easiest solution to this problem of rising taxes and poor services is to hope or to achieve much higher economic growth. Perhaps we'll get lucky. Perhaps there'll be a technological breakthrough. Perhaps AI will really increase productivity and some really cheap renewable energy will come on tap. But increasing economic growth is much more difficult than just wanting it. Truss tried with tax cuts, but that failed. Brexit damaged investment and trade. And it's also worth bearing in mind, though, that it's not just the UK facing lower growth. It's kind of a global issue, particularly in Europe. Even the once mighty German economy is struggling at the moment. The United States is one of the few countries to really have high growth, and that's been really helped by an ambitious level of government spending and government borrowing. So in the absence of really good economic growth, there are not many attractive options to increasing taxes. There's little left to privatise. Raising retirement age or cutting benefits would increase inequality and be unpopular. But we shouldn't be overly pessimistic. There are still ways that over time we can start to improve the performance of the UK economy. This video goes into 10 practical policies that can help improve growth.